The wind howled through the bare trees like an old man's cough, dry and raspy. Whiskey Creek wasn't much of a town, just a string of weathered buildings holding together on the edge of the desert, strung out along the dirt road like old memories clinging to an empty bottle. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows that swept over the dusty streets, and a restless air stirred through the silence. A wedding was about to happen, or at least that's what the townsfolk thought. But the air was thick with something else, something unsaid. A tension clung to the gathering, like the smell of wet leather after a storm, heavy and full of meaning. Lily Harper stood at the edge of the clearing, her white dress billowing lightly in the breeze, her hands shaking slightly as they held onto the bouquet. She was beautiful, in a quiet way, like a wildflower growing in a field, overlooked by most. She had dark hair, cut short, falling softly around her face. Her eyes, large and dark, always seemed to have something distant in them, like they saw things no one else could. But it wasn't the beauty of her face that made her stand out. It was the quietness of her existence. Lily was deaf. The world around her was muffled, muted. She had never heard the laughter of children, the howl of coyotes at night, or the sweet sounds of birds at dawn. She'd never heard the words her father said as he lay dying in their cabin, or the promises made in the dark of night. But she felt them, every single word, every touch, every vibration of the earth beneath her boots. And it was that silence that had brought her to this moment, standing in front of a man who was about to make a vow she could never hear. The townsfolk muttered, shifting uneasily on their feet. It wasn't common for a woman to marry in such a way, in such silence. They watched Lily as if she were a piece of glass that could shatter at the slightest touch. But what they didn't know was that this silence that defined her life, was not a weakness. It was her strength. And then there was the man standing beside her, Thomas Walker. A man carved out of the land itself, hard as the rock, soft as the dusk, and as broken as the sun that sank beneath the horizon. Thomas had lived 1,000 lives before this moment, and none of them had prepared him for what lay ahead. He had fought in the war, lost more than most could bear, and now, standing before the woman who had once saved his life, he was ready to make his final vow. But as the preacher began to speak, Lily didn't hear the words. She didn't hear the promises of love, of devotion, of eternity. Instead, she felt the pulse of Thomas's hand resting lightly on hers. His calloused fingers, rough from years of hard work, held her gently, carefully, as though he feared breaking her. And in that touch, Lily knew everything. She could feel the weight of his love, the depth of his regret, the promise of his future. No words were needed. But in the back of the crowd, hidden in the shadows, a figure watched with dark eyes, a woman who had never forgiven Lily for what she had done, a woman who would stop at nothing to ruin this moment, to take away the happiness that Lily had finally found. As the vows began to be spoken, Lily felt the tension in Thomas's touch shift, a tightening in the grip that had once been so steady. Her heart raced as the air around them seemed to crackle, and for a split second, she felt something cold, something deadly, lurking just beyond the safety of her world. And then she saw it, the flicker of movement in the crowd, the woman who had been watching her, the one who had sworn to see her fall. Would this day end in happiness or would it unravel everything they had fought for? The preacher's voice echoed through the air, muffled yet persistent, filling the space around them with words that meant nothing to Lily. The wind had picked up again, carrying the dust of Whiskey Creek in all directions. But Lily stood still, her heart beating steady and strong, knowing only the press of Thomas's hand, the unspoken vow between them. And then it happened. A subtle shift in the crowd, a flicker of movement, a shadow in the corner of her eye. Lily couldn't hear it, but she felt the change, the subtle hush that fell over the townsfolk, the way their bodies stiffened, their eyes darting to the left. And she saw him, the figure who had been watching them all along, hidden among the rough men and women who had gathered to witness her wedding. She couldn't hear him approach, but she felt the weight of his presence as if he were a boulder rolling down a hill, gaining speed with each passing moment. It wasn't just his size that gave him away. It was the way he moved, swift, calculated, like a predator on the hunt. The man in question was dressed in black, a long coat billowing out behind him as he strode toward the altar. His hat was low over his eyes, shadowing his face, but the coldness of his demeanor was clear. A man who had seen too much, who had been broken by the world and had come back for more. His boots kicked up dust as he approached, the sound of leather hitting earth louder than it should have been. His hands were resting on the handles of two worn pistols, but it wasn't the guns that caught Lily's attention. It was his eyes. Lily's breath hitched, and her fingers tightened on Thomas's hand. Thomas, too, had felt it. The tension that had swept over the crowd, the silent shift in the air. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto the man who had emerged from the shadows. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. A recognition, a shared history, a silent understanding that no words could explain. The stranger wasn't here by chance. He had come for her. And it wasn't just the weight of his presence that made the crowd uneasy. It was the way he moved, with purpose, as if everything he did had been rehearsed in the dark corners of his mind. He was no friend of the town, no well-wisher to the newlyweds. He had come for Lily, and Lily knew it. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a sense of impending danger that crept up her spine like a cold wind. Thomas stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between Lily and the stranger. His voice, rough like gravel, called out to the man, "What do you want?" The stranger didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer, his boots thudding heavily against the ground. And then, in a voice so quiet, so cold, that Lily almost didn't hear it, he spoke. "I've come to collect what's mine." The words hung in the air, like a guillotine waiting to fall. Thomas's grip on Lily's hand tightened, his heart racing with an unfamiliar dread. Lily felt it, too. The weight of the promise behind the stranger's words, the feeling that the past was about to come rushing back. Who was this man, and what claim did he have on Lily? More importantly, what would happen now that he had come to Whiskey Creek? The crowd's breath seemed to catch, collectively holding the town in a suffocating stillness. The stranger's words sank into the air, like a stone in water, rippling out toward the gathered onlookers. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of distant birds and the soft shuffle of boots in the dirt. But Lily could feel the pulse of something far darker beneath it all, something alive in the weight of the man's words. "I've come to collect what's mine." Thomas's hand flexed, instinctively pulling Lily closer, as if to shield her from whatever was coming. His back was straight, his posture tense, yet there was something about his stance that screamed resignation. He had seen men like this before, men who had come to take what they believed they were owed, men who had no mercy in their hearts, no conscience left. Thomas didn't need to ask the stranger's name. He knew who he was, or at least what he had been. The man's presence alone was enough to stir memories in Thomas. Bitter, haunting memories of a time when he had been a different man, fighting different battles. A time when the line between right and wrong had been blurred beyond recognition. It had been in another life, a life where love was nothing more than a fleeting promise, and survival was the only thing that mattered. But this wasn't the war. This wasn't the chaos of a battlefield. This was a quiet town, and it seemed that even in silence, violence had a way of making its presence known. "Who the hell are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice low and steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. The stranger finally lifted his head, his eyes flashing in the dying light of the day. There was no recognition in his gaze, only cold calculation. "You don't remember me, do you, Walker?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. The name felt unfamiliar, yet it gnawed at him, scratching at the edges of his memory. He stepped forward, his boots crunching over the dry earth. "I don't know what you're talking about." A faint smirk played across the stranger's lips, and he took another step forward. The crowd parted like water, allowing him to move through them like a shadow. And as he walked, Thomas's mind raced, trying to place the face beneath the brim of the hat. Something about the man, the way he moved, the way he spoke, was familiar. "I didn't forget," the stranger continued. "You're the one who left me to die." A cold shiver ran down Thomas's spine, and for a moment his world seemed to spin out of control. The memory hit him like a sudden storm. A forgotten battlefield, the smell of smoke and death, the sound of men screaming for their lives, the face of a comrade, someone he had known only by a different name, someone who had shared the same fate, but not anymore. "Your face," Thomas whispered, the truth beginning to settle in his gut. You're the man from the camp." The stranger's eyes darkened, and he stepped forward, his hand brushing against the holster at his side. "You remember me now, don't you? I should have died with them, but you left me behind. You took the easy way out." The townsfolk had stopped breathing, watching the two men exchange words like a duel waiting to happen. No one moved, no one spoke, as if the ground beneath their feet might shatter at any moment. But Lily? Lily had heard nothing of this conversation. She could not hear the words, the anger, the accusation. She could only feel the vibration of the tension in the air. The subtle shift in Thomas's body, the way his posture stiffened. His hand no longer held hers with the warmth of love, but with the sharpness of something harder, more distant. And she knew. The man before them had come for more than her. He had come for revenge. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Thomas stand there, facing the man from his past, the man who had come to collect what he believed was his. She couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the crackling of the energy between them, thick and tense. Who was this man really? And what had Thomas done to him? More importantly, what would this stranger do next? The silence between the two men stretched long enough that the crowd began to shift uneasily on their feet. The wind had returned, sending dust swirling in erratic patterns across the dirt. But it couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in the air. Thomas stood firm, his face set like stone, but inside, his thoughts were unraveling. The past, buried deep beneath the weight of survival, was clawing its way back into the present. He could feel the stranger's gaze burning through him like fire, stoking the embers of memories he had long tried to forget. "You should have died with them," the man repeated, his voice growing louder, more accusing, more venomous. He took another step forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth, as though daring Thomas to do something, anything. "You let me burn. You left me there to rot." Lily's heart raced in her chest, a steady thrum that matched the pounding of her blood. She could feel the shift in Thomas's body, the tension in his hands. His fingers were gripping her hand tighter now, almost painfully. She couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the weight of the conversation, the heaviness of the past that Thomas was carrying like a stone around his neck. She turned to him, her dark eyes searching his face, her lips parted as if to ask what was happening, but her voice remained silent. She wanted to understand, wanted to know what had brought this man here, what had caused this rift, but her world was quiet. Thomas's jaw clenched, and for a moment he didn't speak. His eyes flickered to the man in front of him, then to Lily. His gaze softened just enough for Lily to feel the shift, the love that had always been there, underneath the quiet and the chaos. He could see the confusion in her eyes, the silent question that hung between them, and it made his heart ache. He had promised her peace, a future that was free from the shadows of the past. But now it seemed those shadows had found them, and there was no escaping them. The man stepped closer, a sneer curling on his lips. "Do you remember the camp, Walker? Do you remember the fire, the screams? You left me to burn alive, and now I'm here to collect what you owe me." Lily's breath caught in her throat. The camp, the fire, the screams. A flicker of understanding began to bloom inside her, though it was still clouded by the confusion of not hearing the words. But she could feel it. The weight of guilt that Thomas carried, the burden of something he could never undo. "I didn't leave you," Thomas finally spoke, his voice thick with regret. "I tried to get to you, but they had already taken you. I couldn't." The man's hand shot out, grabbing Thomas by the collar, pulling him closer with the strength of a wild animal. "Liar!" he spat. "You left me. You didn't even try. You turned your back and ran. And now you think you can forget." Lily's heart hammered in her chest, and her body tensed, ready to spring forward, to do something. She couldn't hear the violence in the air, but she could feel it. The raw intensity of the stranger's rage, the way Thomas's own body seemed to grow still, as if he was bracing for something far worse than this moment. With a sudden movement, Thomas shoved the man's hand off his collar, his body reacting instinctively. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice cracking with the weight of years of regret. "I did what I could." But the stranger only laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound, like the rattle of bones in the wind. "What you could, what you did, was abandon me. And now I'm here to take what's mine." Lily's eyes flickered between the two men. She could feel the pull of their emotions, the anger, the regret, the bitterness, thick in the air. It was the past coming alive again, clawing at their feet, unwilling to let them walk free. In that moment, she realized something. She could feel the pain in Thomas's voice, the weight of his words. She didn't need to hear the details. She didn't need to know the exact nature of his past with this man. But she could feel his shame, his sorrow, and she knew that what was happening now was as much about redemption as it was about revenge. And as the two men stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, Lily knew that this moment would not pass quietly. The past was not something that could be buried so easily. The tension between Thomas and the stranger crackled in the air, thick and suffocating. The townsfolk stood frozen, as if the slightest movement would break the fragile thread of silence that had settled over the clearing. The only sound that could be heard was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant chirping of crickets, far away from the scene of rising violence. Lily could feel her pulse quicken, the trembling of her fingers still gripping Thomas's hand. Her heart beat faster, louder than it ever had before, each thump like a drum echoing through her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout for them to stop, but her world was silent. The words were there in her mind, but they never escaped her lips. Thomas stood still, his broad shoulders tense, his jaw clenched. He didn't make a move to strike the man in front of him. He couldn't. There was a weight to the stranger's accusations, a truth that Thomas couldn't escape. He had left him behind, left him to burn in the fire that had consumed the camp. Thomas knew he couldn't deny it. But he also knew that the price of survival had been steep, and the choices he made in those moments of chaos had left scars that no amount of time could heal. The stranger released his grip on Thomas's collar, stepping back slightly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. The anger in his gaze was raw, unrelenting, but there was something else too, something deeper, something twisted. "You left me to die?" he said again, his voice low and full of venom. "I should have died with my brothers, but you had to save yourself. You couldn't even give me that mercy." The words sliced through the air like a knife, each one finding its mark. Thomas's throat tightened, his chest constricting with the weight of his own guilt. He knew the truth of it. The fire had been too fierce, the chaos too overwhelming. He had made a choice in that moment, the only choice he could, and now it seemed that choice had returned to claim him. Lily could feel the change in Thomas's body, the way his muscles tensed, how his hand clenched around her own. She didn't need to hear the words to understand the weight of the man's accusations. She could feel it in his grip, in the tension that rolled off him like a storm cloud. "I didn't have a choice," Thomas muttered, his voice ragged. "There was nothing I could do. I tried to save you, but You failed," the stranger interrupted, his voice rising in anger once more. "You failed, and now you're going to pay." Lily stepped forward slightly, her feet moving of their own accord, though the sound of her steps was lost to her. She wanted to do something, anything, to make it stop. But all she could do was stand there, watching, feeling the weight of the past press down on them both. Thomas turned his head towards her, his eyes briefly meeting hers. There was a flash of something in his gaze, something soft, something fragile, a plea, perhaps, or a promise. She didn't know, but she could feel the heat of his emotions, the rawness that coursed through his veins. The crowd was silent, waiting for something to happen. They had seen enough violence to know when a fight was about to break out, but no one moved. They were watching, waiting for the next moment, the next decision, that would define this terrible encounter. And then, something unexpected happened. The stranger took a step back, lowering his gaze to the ground. For a moment, he seemed to soften, just enough for Lily to see the man behind the anger. His chest rose and fell with the weight of his breathing, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You left me to burn," he said again, but this time the words were quieter, almost defeated. "But I survived. I survived, and I'm not the man I was." Thomas didn't speak. He couldn't. The words that had once been so easy to say, apologies, excuses, pleas, felt hollow now. They would never be enough. They could never make up for what had happened. He had left the man behind, and in some ways, that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But there was something in the stranger's tone now, something that was different. It was no longer just rage. It was something deeper, something that hinted at the price of survival, not just for Thomas, but for all of them. The stranger had lived through hell, and now he was standing here, asking for something. But what? Lily's heart raced as she saw the shift in the stranger's demeanor. Was this a sign of weakness? Or was it just another part of the trap that had been set? As the crowd held its breath, it became clear that this moment wasn't just about revenge. It was about redemption for both men. But would it be enough to heal the wounds that had festered for so long? And what would Thomas do now? Would he confront the man he had abandoned, or would he try to escape the past once again? The wind kicked up once more, sending dust swirling around the clearing like memories long buried. The quiet weight of the moment seemed to press in on them from all sides, suffocating any possibility of escape. The tension in the air was palpable, thick like the smoke from a distant fire. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the crowd, not the two men, not even the earth beneath their boots. It was as if the world was waiting, holding its breath. Lily stood there, her gaze locked on Thomas and the stranger. She couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the silent exchange between them. She could feel Thomas's struggle, his unwillingness to be the man he once was. She could feel the stranger's anger, but beneath it there was something else, a longing for closure, for resolution that had driven him here. The silence stretched on until it was finally broken by the stranger's voice, low and almost resigned. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his words barely a whisper against the wind. "But you owe yourself something." Thomas's brow furrowed, and for a moment he didn't speak. He couldn't understand. "What are you talking about?" "You've been running from your past," the stranger continued, his eyes narrowing with a mix of bitterness and understanding. "But it's here, Walker. It's always been here. You think you can outrun it, but it catches up with you in the end." Lily felt a knot form in her stomach. She could sense the weight of those words in her chest. For a long time, Thomas had tried to leave his past behind. But as much as he had run, as far as he had gone, it had followed him. And now, here it was, standing in front of them, demanding something. The stranger's face softened, his anger flickering like a dying flame. "I'm not here to kill you," he said almost gently. "I'm here to make you see the truth. You can't hide from it anymore. You can't pretend it never happened." Thomas's lips parted, but no words came out. He was lost in the weight of it all, the weight of guilt, of regret, of things that could never be undone. He wanted to fight back, to justify his actions, but the truth of the stranger's words held him in place. "I'm sorry," Thomas finally whispered, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used in years. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to leave you behind, but I didn't know what else to do." The stranger nodded slowly, as if he understood. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by something that resembled a quiet, weary acceptance. "It's too late for apologies, Walker," he said softly, "but it's not too late for redemption." Lily's heart ached, her throat tight with unshed tears. She didn't need to hear the details. She didn't need to know the exact nature of what had happened between Thomas and this man. But she could feel it. The years of suffering, of choices made in desperation, of guilt that had festered like a wound. And now, in this moment, Thomas had been given a choice. The stranger turned and began to walk away, his back to them, his head lowered. But before he disappeared into the crowd, he paused for a brief second, looking back over his shoulder. "You have to live with what you did," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything unspoken. "But you can still make things right." With that, he was gone, disappearing into the twilight like a shadow, vanishing in the night. Thomas stood motionless, his body trembling with the release of something that had been held inside for far too long. Lily reached for his hand, her fingers trembling as they found his. And as their hands clasped, she didn't need to hear the words to know what had passed between them. The past had been faced, and it was time to move forward, together. The townsfolk slowly began to disperse, whispering amongst themselves, unsure of what to make of what had just transpired. But Lily and Thomas remained, standing in the dimming light, the air heavy with the unspoken promises of the future. In life, we all carry the weight of our past. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront it head on, to face the choices we've made and the consequences they bring. If you've ever struggled with the ghosts of your past, remember that redemption isn't about erasing your mistakes, but about learning to live with them and still finding the strength to move forward. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more of these tales of redemption, survival, and emotional reckoning, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What's the hardest decision you've ever had to face? What did it teach you? Let's start the conversation.